The first time I heard someone call my husband the sole founder of his company, I was sitting 3 seats away from him while almost 200 people applauded. I was proud of Richard that night. That matters because I hadn't walked into his retirement dinner carrying 30 years of resentment. Richard was 63, retiring from the company that had consumed most of his adult life. Some of the people in that ballroom had worked for him longer than our daughter had been alive. He had earned their respect, and he had earned mine. About halfway through dinner, the lights dimmed and a tribute video began playing on 2 large screens at the front of the room. The first photograph made me smile. Richard was maybe 30, standing beside one of our earliest printing machines in the garage of the house we rented when we were first married. His hair was thick and dark, his sleeves were rolled up, and he had the expression he always wore when a machine wasn't doing what he thought it should. The narrator said, "It began with one man, one idea, and a garage." People laughed softly. I did too. The video moved through the years, the first rented workshop, the delivery van, the move into a real production building, new equipment. Employees, customers. Then another photograph from the garage appeared. From those humble beginnings, Richard Foster, the company's sole founder, built an organization that would eventually provide livelihoods for nearly 200 people. Sole founder. Everyone applauded. I turned toward Richard. He had heard it. I knew because his smile changed for half a second, the way it did when something made him uncomfortable and he didn't want anyone else to notice. He didn't correct the narrator. He didn't lean toward me and say they'd gotten it wrong. He accepted the applause. Then he reached beneath the table and squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I couldn't stop looking at the photograph fading from the screen. Everyone else saw Richard standing in a garage. I remembered what had been 3 feet outside the frame. A folding table, a cheap telephone, a ledger, a yellow pad covered in customer names. And me. For years, when people asked about Richard's company, I had said things like, "It's Richard's business," or "I was involved a little in the early days." None of those sentences had felt dishonest. But sitting in that ballroom, I realized the story had changed while I wasn't paying attention. By the time Richard retired, I wasn't in the beginning at all. When we got home, Richard loosened his tie in the hallway. That was more emotional than I expected. I know. You okay? I'm tired. So am I. He kissed my forehead and went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen. Years earlier, when we'd moved into that house, Richard had wanted to throw away most of the papers from the first business years. I was the one who had kept a box. I went downstairs, moved 2 storage bins, pulled an old suitcase from beneath a shelf, and found it behind everything else. One corner was crushed inward. Across the top, in Richard's handwriting, were 3 words. Old company stuff. I carried it upstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. Then I opened the lid. The first thing I found was a stack of invoices held together by a dried rubber band that snapped when I touched it. The second thing I noticed was my handwriting. I sat down. The invoices were from the first year Richard and I had been taking commercial jobs from the garage. Most of the company names meant nothing to me anymore, but a few brought back entire rooms. A restaurant that ordered takeout menus, a plumbing company that needed work orders, a church that wanted programs printed for Easter, a neighborhood grocery store whose owner always paid late and somehow made me feel guilty for asking. I found customer lists written on yellow paper. My handwriting. Pricing calculations. Mine again. A notebook divided into columns for paper costs, ink, delivery, and labor. Mine. One page had a sentence written across the bottom in Richard's handwriting. Ask Diane before quoting this again. I laughed before I could stop myself. There were proposals I had typed on a second-hand electric typewriter, notes from customer calls, lists of suppliers, delivery schedules, reminders to collect overdue invoices. Then I found photographs. In one, Richard was standing beside the old press. It was almost the same photograph from the retirement video, except this one had been taken from farther back. And there I was, behind him, sitting at the folding table. The telephone was wedged between my shoulder and my ear, and I was writing something down. I remembered that day. A customer had called because Richard had printed 5,000 pieces with the wrong date. Richard was convinced the customer had approved the proof. The customer was convinced he hadn't. I spent nearly an hour negotiating a reprint that cost us almost everything we were going to make on the job. At the time, it had felt like a disaster. Now I couldn't remember the customer's name. Richard had always understood machinery in a way I never did. He could hear a strange sound across the garage and know whether something needed oil, adjustment, or replacement. He could look at a finished piece and tell you exactly where the color had gone wrong. I knew which customers had paid. I knew which ones needed to be called. I knew what we were charging and whether that price made any sense. Once Richard agreed to a job because he was excited about the technical challenge. I spent 10 minutes with a calculator and told him we would lose money on every piece. He argued. I showed him the numbers. He called the customer back. That was how the early company worked. Richard could make the product. I helped turn that work into a business. The box didn't prove I had built what the company eventually became. It proved something simpler. At the beginning, I had been there. I was holding an old customer sheet when Richard walked into the kitchen. He had changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt. "What are you doing?" "Found something." He saw the box and stopped. "No way. You remember it?" "Of course I remember it." He came around the table and picked up one of the first pricing sheets. "We charged $48 for that." "Was that too much?" "It was barely enough to cover paper." "You were the one who wanted to charge $35. Richard looked at me, then laughed. "That's right. I told you we'd go broke." "You told me that a lot." "You gave me a lot of reasons." For a few minutes, the retirement dinner disappeared. Richard found a photograph of himself asleep in a chair in the garage. "You took this?" "Of course I did." I looked dead. "You'd worked all night." He shook his head. God, we had no idea what we were doing. I looked at him. Privately, Richard still remembered us that way. I picked up the photograph of me at the folding table. "Do the kids know I did all this?" His smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" "Do they know I worked with you at the beginning?" "Sure." "Do they?" He thought about it. "I assume so." "From who?" Richard looked at me. "I don't know. Us, I guess." "Have you ever told them?" "Diane, they're adults. I don't know which company stories we've told them." Neither did I. The box had reminded me of things I had stopped thinking about years ago. Not because Richard had hidden them, because I had stopped considering them important. Richard pulled out another photograph. "Look at that garage." "I know." "How did we fit anything in there?" "We didn't." He smiled. Then I asked, "When did you stop saying we?" He looked up. "What?" "When you tell people how the company started." "I still say we." "Not tonight." His expression changed. "That wasn't my video." No, it wasn't. I closed the box. When Richard and I got married, neither of us intended to start a company. He worked production for a small commercial printer. I worked in the billing office of a medical supply company. We had one car that made a grinding noise whenever I turned left and a kitchen table we'd bought from my aunt for $20. Richard started bringing small jobs home. A friend needed invitations. Someone from church wanted flyers. A neighbor who owned a landscaping company needed forms. Eventually, he bought a used machine that took up most of our garage. The first evening it arrived, I stood in the doorway. "Where's my car supposed to go?" Richard looked around as though the question had never occurred to him. "Driveway?" "You bought a machine before deciding where the car would go?" "I got a great price." "That wasn't the question." He grinned. Richard saw possibility before inconvenience. I usually saw inconvenience first. My involvement started because he had no system. I began tracking orders, then customers, payments, and prices. One night, we sat at the kitchen table rebuilding his pricing because he had forgotten to count his own time, delivery costs, and half the expenses involved in producing a job. When we finished, Richard leaned back. "I've been charging too little." "Yes." "By a lot." "Yes." "How long have you known?" About 20 minutes. "You could have been nicer." I was very nice. He reached across the table and took my hand. "This is ours, you know." I laughed. "What is?" "The business." At that point, calling it a business felt generous. We had a machine that jammed twice a day, a handful of regular customers, and an accounting system built largely around me telling Richard not to spend money we hadn't collected. But he meant it. When our first important contract came in, he didn't sign it until we'd gone through the numbers together. When customers complimented him on how organized things were, he pointed toward me. Richard wanted me there. The difference between us was that he loved the business. I liked it. Richard thought about expansion at breakfast. He talked about equipment during movies. He could describe a new press for 20 minutes to anyone careless enough to ask how work was going. I liked solving problems and talking to customers. I liked watching something we'd created become stable. I never dreamed about doing it for the rest of my life. When the company grew enough that Richard wanted to quit his regular job, we spent weeks running numbers before he finally did it. Later, I left my own job and joined him full-time. For a while, we were good at it. Then Natalie was born. I thought I would take a short break and return. Instead, I spent months trying to be useful everywhere and fully present nowhere. Richard suggested childcare. I said no. He suggested shorter hours. I tried them. It didn't solve the problem. One night after Natalie was asleep, we sat at the same kitchen table where we'd once fixed his pricing. Richard said, "You're miserable." "I'm tired." "You're miserable and tired." "That's possible. We can figure this out." I shook my head. "I don't think I want to." "What does that mean?" "I think I want to stop working at the company." Richard stared at me. "You don't have to leave." "I know. We can hire someone." "I know. You can do whatever hours you want." "I know." "Then what are we solving?" I looked toward the baby monitor. "I'm not sure this is what I want my life to be." Richard was quiet. "You want this more than I do." "That's not a reason to leave." "It might be. This is ours." There it was again. Only this time ours sounded like a future I wasn't sure I wanted. I reached for his hand. "Keep building it." Richard didn't accept that easily. For weeks he kept finding ways I could stay involved. I kept saying no. Eventually he hired someone to take over most of my work. For a while he still brought things home for me to review. Then fewer things came. Then almost none. I didn't regret leaving. I raised our children, and years later I built another working life in a school district. I had colleagues, responsibilities, and an identity that had nothing to do with Richard's company. A few years after I left, a local newspaper wanted to profile the business. Richard told the reporter, "You should talk to Diane too. She was there when we started." I waved him off. Later he said, "They were taking pictures next week. You should come." "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't work there." "You helped start it." "I don't need my name in the paper." He tried once more. I still said no. When the article appeared, Richard was described as the founder. I read it and didn't care. At least I don't remember caring. Years later, when someone told me Richard had built quite a company, I said, "He did." When someone asked whether I had worked there, I said, "Only in the early days. It's Richard's company now." I meant that he ran it now. I didn't realize how easily people would stop hearing that last word. That part was on me. What I couldn't explain away was Richard hearing sole founder at his retirement dinner and saying nothing. Once I started thinking about it, I could trace the change in only a few sentences. At first, people said Richard and Diane started the business. Later, Richard started the business and Diane helped in the early days. Eventually, Richard founded the company in his garage. Then Natalie came over and found me sorting the box. She was 34 and lived close enough that she still came through the kitchen door without knocking. "What is all this?" "Your father's first attempt at organization." She laughed and picked up an invoice. "This is ancient." "Thank you." Then she found one of the customer sheets. "This is your handwriting." "Yes." "You did these?" "Most of them." She picked up another page. "You handled customers?" "In the beginning." "I didn't know that." I looked at her. "What did you think I did?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Helped Dad sometimes?" "Helped how?" She shrugged. "Answered phones, maybe did some bookkeeping." I did those things. I also wrote proposals, helped set prices, tracked customers, scheduled jobs, chased invoices, and helped decide which work we could afford to take. Natalie's expression changed. "Really?" That one word hurt more than anything in the retirement video. I nodded. "For several years." I honestly didn't know. "Did Dad ever tell you?" "I'm sure he did." "You just said you didn't know." Natalie looked uncomfortable. "Mom, I'm not saying you didn't do anything. I just always thought Dad started it and you helped for a little while." She picked up the garage photograph. "Is that you?" "Yes." "I've seen pictures of Dad from around then. I don't think I've ever seen this one." Of course she hadn't. Richard's early photographs had been in company lobbies, presentations, anniversary material, and retirement videos. Mine had been under a suitcase. I had put it there. But Richard knew what had been inside the box, too. That evening, I found him reading in the den. Can I ask you something? Sure. When did people start calling you the sole founder? He lowered the paper. You're still thinking about that? Yes. I don't know. You must have some idea. Diane, people call me all kinds of things. I'm asking about the company. He put the paper down. What are we actually talking about? Natalie didn't know. Didn't know what? That I worked there. Richard frowned. Of course she knows. No, she thought I answered phones and did a little bookkeeping. You did those things. You know that's not all I did. I didn't say it was. She didn't know. Richard sighed. Then tell her. I stared at him. That's your answer? What do you want me to say? She's 34. If there's something she doesn't know about our lives, tell her. Our lives? Yes. Then why doesn't she know it from you? Richard's face tightened. Diane, I don't know what I've told Natalie about 35 years ago. I started toward the door. Then he said, there was that anniversary thing. I stopped. What anniversary thing? Richard didn't answer immediately. And for the first time since the retirement dinner, I knew he remembered something he hadn't wanted to remember. The company had celebrated a major anniversary several years earlier. I remembered the dinner, the commemorative booklet, and the company history that had appeared online. I hadn't read most of it. Richard had. What anniversary thing? I asked again. He rubbed his forehead. Communications interviewed me for the company history. About the beginning? About everything. Did they ask about me? Richard's pause answered before he did. Yes. What did they ask? I don't remember exactly. You remember enough to bring it up. He looked irritated. They asked whether you were involved when I started. When we started. He exhaled. Fine, when we started. And what did you say? I said you helped in the beginning. I stared at him. That's what you said? Something like that. Something like what? Richard stood and walked toward the window. I don't have a transcript, Diane. I'm not asking for one. He folded his arms. I told them you helped out at the beginning, but the company was really my thing. The sentence was so ordinary that it took me a second to understand why it bothered me. You said I helped out. You did. I worked there. I know. I was there before we had an office. I know. I set prices with you. I know. I handled customers. I know all of this. Then why did you tell them I helped out? Because by the time anyone knew the company, you were gone. That's not what they asked. Richard's jaw tightened. They were writing a short company history, not our marriage biography. And then they called you sole founder. I don't know if that came from the interview. Did you see the history? Of course. Did it call you sole founder? Richard looked away. Yes. And you left it. He didn't answer. You knew the story wasn't accurate anymore. That's not fair. What part isn't fair? I never told anyone you weren't there. You didn't have to. They asked whether I was there, and you reduced me to someone who helped out. Richard's voice rose. Because you did help out. I helped build the beginning. And then you left. The room went quiet. Richard continued. You left, Diane. I know. I asked you not to. I know. You didn't want to stay. I know. You didn't want a title. I never said that. You wouldn't even do the newspaper interview. That's different. How? Because I didn't want publicity. Richard gave a short, disbelieving laugh. You spent years saying you didn't care who got credit. I didn't. Exactly. That doesn't mean I wasn't there. I never said you weren't. You let everyone else say it. No, they said I founded the company. They said you were the sole founder. Richard shook his head. You are turning one word into something much bigger. Because one word changed the meaning. He looked at me for a long moment. Then the defensiveness became something sharper. You want to talk about what really happened? Yes. Fine. He pointed toward the kitchen where the box still sat. We started something small together, that's true. You did the books, you called customers, you helped set prices, you did a lot. Thank you. Don't do that. Do what? Don't make me sound like I'm finally admitting something. I've never denied it. Then why didn't you correct them? Because after you left, I spent the next 3 decades building that company. I know. Do you? His voice changed. You remember the garage? I remember the years after that, too. So do I. No, you remember me coming home. That stopped me. Richard continued. You weren't there when we nearly missed payroll because our biggest customer paid 6 weeks late. You weren't there when I signed the lease on the second building and spent 2 years wondering if I'd destroyed us. You weren't there when the bank wanted more collateral. You weren't there when I had to tell 20 people we were cutting hours because orders had collapsed. I opened my mouth. He held up his hand. I'm not blaming you. You had another life. We agreed on that. But don't stand there 30 years later and talk like the company everyone was celebrating last night was something we built equally. I haven't said that. Then what are you saying? I'm saying the beginning was ours. And I'm saying you walked away from it. I stepped away from the company. What is the difference? I don't know yet. Richard stared at me. Then he said the part I couldn't dismiss. You asked me to keep building it. I know. You told me it was mine. I said it was your company now. You said that for years. I know. You declined interviews. You didn't want to come to company events. Half the time when someone asked you about the business, you changed the subject. I know. You spent 30 years telling me you didn't need the credit. He stopped. Then more quietly he asked, when did I become dishonest for believing you? I had no answer. Richard wasn't wrong about the facts. I had left. He had asked me to stay. I had refused interviews. I had told people it was his company. Maybe he had simply believed me. He watched my face. I didn't erase you, Diane. I looked at him. I'm not sure yet. His expression hardened. You told me it was mine. Then he walked out of the room. I stayed where I was. The worst arguments in a marriage aren't always the ones where someone says something cruel. Sometimes they're the ones where the other person says something true. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept trying to decide what part of Richard's argument I couldn't accept. He had built the company after I left. There was no honest version of the story where that stopped being true. When business was good, our family benefited. When it was bad, Richard carried most of the fear. I wasn't going to reach backward and claim decades I hadn't lived. But when I had said, it's your company now, I had meant I wasn't participating anymore. I hadn't meant the years before that sentence ceased to exist. The next evening, I found Richard making coffee even though it was nearly 8. You're going to regret that. I already regret a lot of things this week. I almost smiled. I sat down. I've been thinking about what you said. So have I. You were right about some of it. Richard looked at me. That's a dangerous way to start a conversation. I mean it. You built almost everything that company became. He said nothing. I didn't spend the next 30 years there. You did. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. Okay. And you're right that I told you to keep building it. You told me it was mine. I looked at him. I gave you what came next. I didn't give you the beginning. Richard frowned. What does that mean? It means I left the company. I didn't leave the years before I left. Diane, no one is taking your memories. Apparently enough people are that our daughter thinks I answered phones for you. Richard leaned back. Natalie misunderstanding something isn't proof of a conspiracy. I didn't say it was. Then what are we doing? I'm explaining why I care now. Why now? Because the version everyone tells has become the version our own children believe. He looked away. I don't want your 30 years. What? I don't want credit for the company you built after I left. I don't want people saying we did the same thing. Richard looked at me. Good, because we didn't. I know. He seemed surprised. We built the beginning together. You built what came after. For the first time since the argument began, he didn't immediately respond. Finally, he said, every time someone called us co-founders, it bothered me. Why? Because after a while, it sounded like they were saying we built the same thing. We didn't. Richard looked at me. I know what you did after I left. I'm not trying to take it. He looked down at his coffee. I don't think I knew how to explain the difference. So eventually you stopped trying. Maybe. He rubbed his forehead. So what do you want? I don't know yet. We've been fighting for days and you don't know? I know what I don't want. I don't want to become the forgotten founder who supposedly built half the company while you took all the glory. That isn't what happened. Good. I don't want money. I didn't think you did. I don't want a board seat. You would hate a board seat. I would? That almost made him smile. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. It's Lauren. Lauren from communications? Yes. He read the message. What? They're putting together the permanent retirement display in the lobby. Old photos, company history, that kind of thing. She wants to know if I have anything from the garage years. We both looked toward the cardboard box. Richard said, I can take it in. I looked at him. Then I said, I'll take it. Lauren Brooks had worked for the company for almost 12 years. She was visibly delighted when I carried the old box into the conference room. You have no idea how happy this makes me. I think Richard is going to be offended. He has given me 6 photographs of himself standing next to equipment. That sounds right? Lauren laughed and opened the box. She picked up an early pricing sheet. Who did these? I did. Then a proposal. This too? Yes. She found the garage photograph. That's you. Yes. She studied the materials for another moment. I didn't know you were this involved. There was no judgment in her voice. Just surprise. I had heard that tone recently. Lauren looked at me. Was the retirement video why you brought these in yourself? Partly. She closed the folder. I didn't write that video, but some of the history language came from the existing company materials. The anniversary version. Yes. If it's inaccurate, we can change it. I looked at the box. Richard built most of the company everyone knows today. I know. He ran it for decades after I left. Lauren nodded. I don't want you replacing one simple story with another. What would be accurate? We started it together. I worked in the early years, then I stepped away, and Richard built what came after. Would you be comfortable with co-founder? If you explain what happened after. Lauren nodded. That was enough. When I got home, Richard was waiting in the kitchen. How did it go? Fine. What did Lauren say? She wants to correct the history. Richard's face changed. Correct it how? I told her what happened. Meaning? That we started it together and I left during the early years. He was quiet. Then he said, Did she ask about co-founder? Yes. And? I said if they use it, they need to explain that you built what came after. Richard leaned against the counter. So they're changing it. That's the idea. He exhaled. What? I don't want this turning into some correction of my entire career. It isn't. That's easy for you to say. What are you afraid people will think? He took a moment. That I took something from you. That was the first thing he had said that made me understand his fear instead of only his argument. I spent my entire life building that company. I don't want to retire with everyone suddenly wondering if the real story is that my wife built it and I took the credit. That's not the story. People like simple stories, Diane. I looked at him. Yes, I've noticed. Are you trying to make them change everything? No. Then what are you trying to change? For the first time since the retirement dinner, I knew exactly how to answer. I want the first sentence to be true. Richard stared at me. What? The first sentence. When the company tells people how it started, I want that sentence to be true. That's all? That's not small. I didn't say it was. You sound surprised I don't want something else. I don't know what you want anymore. Then listen. Richard pulled out a chair and sat down. I sat across from him. I don't want your company. I don't want a title that makes people think I spent 30 years building something I didn't. I don't want another ceremony. I don't want you giving me years that belong to you. Then why does the first sentence matter so much? Because Natalie didn't know. He looked up. Our own daughter thought I answered phones for you for a little while. She was a child when any of this happened. Exactly. She only knows what we told her, what she heard, what the company said, what you said, what I didn't say. My voice tightened. I'm not asking strangers to remember me, Richard. I'm asking us not to teach our own family that I wasn't there. Richard looked toward the doorway. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I didn't know Natalie thought that. Neither did I. I'm sorry. I didn't rush to answer. He looked down at his hands. I still think this got complicated because you didn't want recognition. It did. You have to own that. I do. He nodded. Then he said, and I have to own that I like the simple version. There was no drama in the sentence. That made me believe it. After a while, being the founder felt true because I was the one there every day. And when they started saying sole founder, I knew it wasn't technically right. You saw it in the anniversary history? Yes. You could have changed it. Yes. Why didn't you? Richard took a long time before answering. Because changing it meant explaining something I didn't want to explain. What? That we started it together, you left, I kept going, and somehow both things were true. I nodded. That's exactly the explanation. He gave a tired laugh. That's a terrible company slogan. It's a better history. Richard looked toward the cardboard box. Then he picked up his phone. For a second, he only held it. I didn't say anything. This was the first time correcting the story had become his decision instead of mine. He looked at me. If we change it, we'd change it accurately. Yes. No one writes that you built the company for 30 years. I would object before you did. That earned the smallest smile. Then Richard called Lauren. I went into the kitchen while he spoke, but I heard enough. The old version isn't accurate. A pause. No, don't make it sound like Diane ran the company for 30 years. That's not right either. Another pause. We started it together. She handled a lot of the early operations. She stepped away, and I built it from there. I stood at the counter with my back to him. For the first time since the retirement dinner, I felt something inside me loosen. Not victory. Relief. A week later, Lauren emailed us the revised history. It said that Richard and Diane Foster had started the business from their home and garage, working together through its earliest years. It explained that I had helped develop customer relationships, pricing, billing, and daily operations before stepping away, and that Richard had led the company's expansion over the decades that followed. I read it twice. Then I handed the laptop to Richard. What do you think? He read it. It's too much about me. I laughed. You're impossible. I'm serious. It's accurate. He looked at me. You're sure? Yes. That weekend, Natalie came over again. Richard was showing her old photographs when he found the one from the garage. Natalie smiled. That's the picture from the retirement video. Almost. He turned it toward her. This is the full one. She looked closer. Mom's in it. Richard nodded. That's when your mother and I were starting the company. I looked at him. He didn't look back. He was already telling Natalie about the terrible machine behind us. But I heard the difference. The company updated the lobby display without ceremony. No announcement went out, no newspaper called. Most employees probably never noticed that the first paragraph had changed. That was fine. What changed showed up more often in smaller places. Once at dinner with friends, Richard said, Diane and I built the company from the garage. I interrupted. The beginning. Everyone looked at me. Richard laughed. Yes, the beginning. Then she escaped and left me with it. That is much more accurate. Our friends laughed too. On the drive home, Richard said, I thought you wanted me to say we. I want you to tell the truth. I was telling the truth. You made it sound like I spent 30 years there. You're very difficult to credit properly. I've been telling you that. He smiled. We didn't solve 37 years of marriage because one paragraph changed. Sometimes Richard still became defensive when I corrected an old story. Sometimes I wondered whether I was listening too closely to every pronoun. But the subject stopped feeling dangerous. A few weeks after the retirement dinner, Richard and I emptied the rest of the box across our kitchen table. There was an early logo so ugly that neither of us could remember approving it. You designed this, Richard said. I absolutely did not. Your handwriting is on the back. That proves nothing. It says Richard likes version 2. Then clearly you designed it. We found the invoice from a customer who had paid us 6 weeks late. Richard still remembered his name. I didn't. We found a photograph of our old delivery van with a dent in the passenger door. You did that, Richard said. You did. I wasn't driving. You distracted me.
How?
You were arguing about directions. I was giving directions. The wrong ones. 35 years later, and you're still blaming me for that door. Because you were responsible. He laughed. So did I. Then Richard picked up the photograph of me at the folding table. He studied it for a long time. I was younger than Natalie was now. My hair was pulled back. There was a pencil behind my ear. The telephone cord stretched across the table. Richard turned the picture toward me. You looked happy. I probably was. He kept looking at it. Then he asked, "Do you wish you'd stayed?" I knew what he meant. Stayed at the company. I thought about it before answering. No. Richard looked surprised. You don't? No. Not even a little? I wonder sometimes what would have happened. That's different. What do you think would have happened? I probably would have driven you insane. You did that anyway. Exactly. Imagine if we'd shared an office. He smiled. I looked at the photograph again. I don't wish I'd stayed. Richard waited. I just wish leaving hadn't made it look like I was never there. He was quiet for a moment. Then he placed the photograph back on the table instead of putting it into the box. That was where we left it. If stories about the truths people carry inside long marriages stay with you, subscribe to Scarred Minds. And I'm curious what you think. Where do you think Richard crossed the line? Was it when he stopped correcting people, or only when he knowingly let the company call him the sole founder?